Welcome to an EchoTales production, where ordinary places hold extraordinary secrets. And every story invites you to listen a little closer. Settle in, dim the lights if you'd like, and open your mind to the unexpected. Let's begin with tonight's tale.
Why did this happen? Please, can somebody please tell me why?
Some moments in life go unnoticed, like brief encounters with strangers, or whispered words that are soon forgotten. But there are also moments that linger, leaving an indelible mark in our minds. These moments awaken dormant memories and instincts that leave a lasting impression for a lifetime. Our story begins with a man who survived something unimaginable, not because of his physical strength, but through the remarkable ability of his mind to block it. When Daniel was a teenager, something unimaginable happened beyond his control. By the time he reached middle age, Daniel had built a fulfilling life. He was a devoted husband and a patient father, the kind of man who listened more than he spoke. He moved gently through the world, being careful with other people's feelings. Those closest to him routinely described him as compassionate and kind. Daniel moved forward, building a peaceful life with his wife Sarah, sharing everything with her that happened in his past, and upholding the value of honesty. The most devastating thing that had ever happened existed only as part of an official record. A trial had taken place with doctors and experts who provided testimony on his behalf, explaining the limitations of human cognition when under extreme duress. The court ruled that, under unbearable strain, his mind did what it needed to do in order to survive, and Daniel did not remember any of it. The loss of memory allowed Daniel to heal. He built a life shaped by tenderness, routine, and love. Days passed quietly into years, and as far as Daniel was concerned, the past had done its worst to him. We'll return shortly with Act 1. Daniel cherished his evenings. It was his favorite part of the day. Once he stepped inside and shut the front door behind him, the house settled into its comforting routine, and everything outside faded away. Shoes were left by the entrance, backpacks leaned against the wall, and the aroma of dinner filled the air. All of it, unmistakably, was Sarah's touch. She prepared his favorite meal, as she often did, as a small gesture of appreciation for the little things she noticed. Love in their home wasn't declared. It was quietly woven into their daily routine. Meals were shared as a family, with the children talking excitedly while Daniel listened. He smiled and asked questions to show he was paying attention. He tucked the children into bed at night, leaving one nightlight on. He stayed with them until the room was still, until their breathing evened out, and until the day finally loosened its grip on them. Daniel never hurried these moments. He joined Sarah in the kitchen, helping her clear the table. The soft clinking of dishes in the sink created a gentle melody. The house hummed with subtle sounds of water and movement. They worked side by side, chatting and laughing easily in a harmonious rhythm that felt natural. a testament to the years they had spent together. When they finally settled down on the sofa, sipping a glass of wine, Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. Daniel placed his hand over hers, lightly tracing a circle as he'd done many times before.
I love you.
We've built a good life together.
I couldn't ask for more.
Sarah loved Daniel, and his love for her was even greater. He was always present and thoughtful. Their life together wasn't just ordinary. It was something even more meaningful. We'll return shortly with Act 2. Before Daniel ever experienced the tranquility of a quiet home, he resided in a compound. It was the only world he knew throughout his childhood and into adolescence. The compound was situated far from any town and arranged with careful intention. The buildings were low and evenly spaced, with paths that had been worn smooth through repeated use. Fences marked the boundaries without ever being explicitly named. Everything had a purpose and a logical order. From a distance, it appeared peaceful, purposeful, and even safe. Families lived together, but not in the traditional sense. Children were raised communally. Although bloodlines weren't always clear, it was understood that many of the children had been fathered by the cult leader himself, which was seen as a blessing and proof of devotion. To ensure proper instruction and guidance, the children were grouped separately. They were encouraged to rely on structure rather than attachment, which was presented as discipline, preparation, and necessary for their growth. Daniel was quite young at the time. He was too young to question the meticulous planning of his days or the hushed whispers surrounding certain names. He quickly discovered which questions elicited smiles and which ones remained unanswered. Like most children, he conformed to the prevailing norms. Each day adhered to an established routine. Mornings began early and quietly, with children rising on time, dressing quickly, and gathering promptly. Bells signaled each transition between activities. Meals were simple and eaten in silence, consistently at the same time and location, under attentive supervision. There was comfort in knowing what came next, but there was also discomfort in questioning it. While conversations weren't prohibited, they remained limited and intentional, primarily focusing on expressions of gratitude. The hours that followed were filled with instructions. Activities included reading, memorization, physical tasks, and quiet reflection. There was little distraction between learning and obedience, as both were framed as essential. Praise was rare and used only to reinforce conformity. Daniel learned early what was expected of him. He completed assigned tasks, stood where he was told, and spoke only when spoken to. This wasn't because the rules were explicitly written, but because they were embodied in the compound's culture. The compound rewarded awareness of tone, posture, and timing. Children who adapted seamlessly were left undisturbed. Those who failed to conform were swiftly corrected. People spent their afternoons together, sharing work and taking turns with responsibilities. Personal belongings were minimal, and ownership was always temporary. Nothing belonged to anyone for long. Sometimes, Daniel noticed he wasn't much different from the other children, even if he couldn't yet express that thought into words. Evenings were marked by group assembly where the leader spoke. Questions were rare, and consensus was generally presumed. At the end of each day, the compound transitioned into rest progressively, rather than simultaneously, reflecting an organized and unobtrusive process. The leader was always present, even when he wasn't physically in the room. His voice resonated throughout the compound, measured, calm, and exuding certainty. People listened attentively when he spoke. Some leaned forward while others responded with more intense reactions. Women sometimes swayed or even collapsed, overwhelmed by an inexplicable force that no one dared to question. This phenomenon was seen as the physical manifestation of devotion and faith. Daniel did not understand any of it. He only noticed that the air felt different whenever the leader appeared. His mother watched intently during those moments. Her expression underwent transformations that Daniel couldn't describe. She held deep beliefs, but not without sacrifices. His father, on the other hand, had begun to withdraw. He spoke quietly and rarely addressed others, except in private with his wife. At night, Daniel laid in a narrow bed among other children, gazing at the ceiling. He wasn't filled with happiness or fear, but rather a sense of being contained. It was as if every aspect of his being had been assigned a specific place. Over time, subtle changes began to take shape. His father's absence stretched longer, and the rules became stricter, though no one dared to acknowledge the changes. By the time they fled the compound, Daniel was in his late teens, and old enough to understand the danger of their actions. He witnessed the fear his parents tried to hide, and knew that their lives would never be the same. Their departure was quiet, with no ceremony and no goodbye. They began a new life in a new home with new identities. Life outside the compound was bustling and full of energy. Streets were much broader than Daniel had ever imagined, and stores were filled with an array of colors and choices. Nights were quiet with no bells or calls to assemble, and for the first time, his parents slept with their door closed. Daniel learned a different rhythm then, one that belonged to his family rather than a system. He learned the significance of this rhythm. And in time, the compound became something distant, a place Daniel had once lived but no longer thought about. A chapter that ended without ceremony. What mattered was they were free. We'll return shortly with Act 3. "30 years ago, when Daniel was a teenager, still residing under his parents' roof, something unimaginable happened beyond his control. He discovered that his family had been found in their home without any signs of forced entry or evidence of an intruder. The details were never directly shared with him. Instead, he received reports and carefully explained accounts from individuals who believed that gentleness might lessen the impact. Daniel eventually learned that he was the one responsible, but he had no recollection of the night in question. He remembered the day before, an ordinary day when he walked home from high school. He remembered having dinner with his family and later going to bed. But then a blank space enveloped him. His mind had shut down and locked itself inside. Doctors diagnosed it as psychogenic amnesia, a defense mechanism that protects the mind from distressing reality. Daniel underwent a series of evaluations, examinations, and observations. They posed questions he couldn't answer and presented him with facts he didn't recognize as his own. He stood trial for the gruesome murder of his entire family. Doctors testified that the unbearable strain had fractured his mind. causing him to commit the killings in a state of psychogenic dissociation. He had no recollection of the killings, and most unsettling of all, the loss of memory appeared permanent. Daniel was found not guilty and acquitted of murder, not because the events were disputed, but because it was determined that the circumstances couldn't be reliably repeated, reconstructed, or interpreted as intentional acts. Evaluators found no evidence of cruelty, malice, or violent tendencies in him. Instead, they observed a young man whose psychological state had broken under overwhelming stress. Daniel was not privy to all the information then. Years passed, and he healed. He met Sarah, they got married, and he became a father. He lived a life of peace and fulfillment, oblivious to the forces that had once shaped him. One evening, decades later, he found himself in a convenience store, picking up a few forgotten items. The exchange was brief. A stranger brushed past him near the counter. The man murmured something too quiet to be heard clearly and too fleeting to matter. Daniel paid, left, and drove home. What transpired next would later be described as another inexplicable tragedy. Once again, there was no struggle, no warning, and no memory. Daniel was found inconsolable, devastated beyond comprehension. He couldn't explain what he had done because he didn't know. A man who truly loved his wife and children, who had never once harmed them in thought or deed, had lost them by his own hands without awareness. This time, investigators delved deeper. Only then did someone recall a detail from years earlier. When Daniel was a teenager walking home from high school, a man passed him on the sidewalk. There was no confrontation or exchange of words. Instead, there was a brief brush of shoulders and a few words spoken under the man's breath. These words were too quiet to register and too ordinary to question. Only later did it become clear that the same detail reappeared in the surveillance footage decades later in the convenience store. They made a groundbreaking discovery that no one had noticed before. Years earlier, on the compound, there had been men whose voices possessed extraordinary power. They weren't the leader himself, but they spoke on his behalf, delivering instructions that were never questioned and commanded obedience through unwavering devotion. The leader remained distant. His presence was reserved for gatherings, ceremonies, and moments of collective devotion. Women would faint in his presence, and followers described a profound sense of surrender and emptiness that washed over them all at once. This all happened while others ensured that the leader's will was carried out. And the leader himself remained untouched and uncompromised. Children were separated, commands were quietly given, and triggers were planted and buried deep. Daniel, unfortunately, was not spared. He had been conditioned. The words spoken to him once as a boy unlocked something within him long before he could comprehend it. This mechanism, capable of overriding memory, choice, and will, had taken hold. Daniel had always been peaceful, yet he was taken advantage of and exploited. The truth didn't bring back his family or restore what he'd lost, and Daniel couldn't recall any of it. Perhaps that might have been the deepest kindness or the harshest cruelty. Because somewhere between innocence and blame, between control and utter collapse, Daniel's mind survived by letting go. Life's endless cycle of causes and consequences kept spinning, but Daniel was never steering. Instead, he was the one being swept along for the ride. We'll return shortly with our final thoughts. Some lives are shaped by memories, while others find peace in letting go of the past. Daniel, unaware of the forces at play, and a cycle that once guided his behavior, demonstrated how actions can often be mistaken for intent. Some individuals disengage at just the right moment, where others forget the event entirely. This has been an EchoTales production. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed today's story. Join us again for more intriguing tales from the shadows and the spaces in between. There are more mysteries waiting just beyond the quiet. Until next time, keep your eyes open.